first thing that shattered was a ceramic mug from Mama Rosa's Café. It didn't fall. It was swept off the counter by Luca Moretti, a man whose tattooed arms were accustomed to breaking things without consequence. Coffee spread across the tile like a dark stain as glass carafes and sugar containers followed in a rhythmic, violent sequence. By the time Luca turned to leave, the interior was a wreck. Rosa Marconi said nothing, watching him with a quiet, heartbreaking resilience that unnerved him more than a scream. Luca walked out without looking back, a man who had spent a decade reshaping the city by replacing old community hubs with cold, steel towers. Luca Moretti was a 35-year-old titan of the underworld who had spent years carving his name into the city through iron-fisted intimidation. He didn't just run rackets. He absorbed entire blocks, replacing old community hubs with cold, profitable fortresses. His new headquarters was meant to be his crowning achievement, a massive fortress complex where every lot had been cleared except for one. Mama Rosa's Café remained wedged between the rising steel like a stubborn piece of history that refused to move. Luca had offered market value, then triple, but Rosa Marconi had declined every time, explaining that the shop was her heritage, not a transaction. His enforcers were clear. Construction could not move forward until that parcel was secured. So Luca decided he would go himself, because in his experience, things that resisted him simply hadn't been confronted directly enough. Luca Moretti stood in the center of the construction site, a shirtless titan against a backdrop of rising steel and grinding machinery. At 35, he moved with the upright, confident posture of a man who owned the very air he breathed. His broad shoulders and muscular back were a canvas of intricate tattoos, dark ink marking him as the undisputed authority of the city's underworld. To the men working beneath the shadow of his ambitious fortress headquarters, he was an untouchable king, a figure of strength and cold detachment who never turned back to acknowledge the wreckage he left behind. He had spent a decade reshaping the skyline, not with blueprints and handshakes, but with the ruthless efficiency of an empire builder who viewed neighborhoods as assets and people as obstacles. His presence alone was a form of intimidation, short, closely trimmed hair, and a face etched with the hardness of 1,000 battles fought and won. He didn't seek approval from the city's boardrooms or its back alleys. He demanded total control. To Luca, power was measured by what he could break and what he could build in its place. He had successfully absorbed every lot on the block, clearing away the history of the neighborhood to make room for his crowning achievement. He was a man who had never once lost sleep over the cost of his ambition, believing that anything resisting his progress simply hadn't been confronted with enough force. But as he looked out over the sprawling footprint of his new empire, his gaze always snagged on the one blemish he couldn't erase. Amidst the high-end retail plans and premium residential units, one small corner remained defiant. He had built a life on being the most decisive person in any room, a man who didn't second-guess his path or owe anyone an explanation. Yet, as he adjusted his dark trousers and prepared for the day's business, the memory of a quiet woman in a stained apron remained stuck in his mind like a splinter. He was the king of the city, but for the first time in his life, he was facing an enemy that didn't fear his crown. Rosa Marconi didn't own much, but she owned the silence of the early morning and the heavy, iron-bound deed to the corner of 5th and Main. As the sun began to crawl over the jagged horizon of Luca Moretti's rising skyscrapers, she stood behind her counter, the steam from a single espresso cup rising to meet the morning light. Mama Rosa's Café was a relic of a different era, a place of scuffed wood, handwritten menus, and the persistent, comforting scent of roasted beans and cinnamon. It was a sanctuary that refused to be swallowed by the cold glass and steel closing in around it. The pressure hadn't started with a sledgehammer, it had started with a suit. Luca's lawyers had come first, sliding thick envelopes across the scarred mahogany counter. They spoke of fair market value, unprecedented opportunities, and relocation packages that would have allowed Rosa to retire to the coast for 3 lifetimes. She had listened politely, poured them water, and then handed the envelopes back unopened. To them, the café was a strategic parcel on a map, a necessary acquisition for a multi-billion-dollar lobby. To Rosa, it was the place where her mother had taught her that a cup of coffee could be a prayer, and where the neighborhood's history was etched into the floorboards. When the lawyers failed, the protection visits began. Men with thick necks and eyes like flint would linger by the door, their presence a silent tax on her customers' peace of mind. They spoke of the dangers of operating in such a busy construction zone, of accidental fires or falling debris. They suggested that for a monthly fee, Luca Moretti's organization could ensure her safety. Rosa's response was always the same, a steady gaze and a quiet refusal. She didn't shout and she didn't call the police. She simply continued to serve her regulars, her curly hair pulled back, her apron tied tight. Her protest wasn't found in picket signs or loud declarations. It was found in the way she polished the brass handles of the front door every morning. It was a silent, unmovable defiance. She knew who Luca Moretti was. Everyone did. He was the man who had never been told no, the shirtless titan who believed that everything had a price. But Rosa understood something Luca didn't. Some things aren't transactions. They are legacies. As the shadows of the construction cranes lengthened over her roof, Rosa remained a heartbeat in the center of a machine, waiting for the moment the king would finally come to see the woman who dared to stand her ground. The bell above the door chimed with a cheerful, delicate ring that was instantly swallowed by the heavy silence Luca Moretti brought into the room. He didn't come with his lawyers or his enforcers this time. He came as the storm itself. Standing in the center of the cafe, his shirtless, tattooed frame seemed to suck the oxygen out of the small space, his physical presence broadcasting a cold detachment that made the humming refrigerator sound like a scream. He didn't start by speaking. He started by acting. With a slow, deliberate movement, Luca reached out and swept a row of hand-painted Mama Rosa mugs off the counter. The sound of the first one hitting the floor was sharp, a rhythmic porcelain crack that echoed against the scuffed linoleum. He didn't stop. His arm moved like a scythe, sending glass carafes of cream and jars of artisanal sugar toppling in a violent sequence. The interior of the cafe, which had taken Rosa decades to curate, began to dissolve into a wreckage of spilled dark roast and jagged shards. A bucket of silver spoons tipped sideways, clattering across the entrance like falling coins. Through all of it, Rosa Marconi remained unmovable. She stood behind the ruined counter, her hands pressed flat against the wood, watching him with an expression of quiet heartbreak. She didn't shout for the police, and she didn't plead for him to stop. Her silence was a weight, a resilient pressure that seemed to unnerve Luca more than any physical resistance could. He knocked the vintage espresso machine, the heart of the shop, off its perch, watching it hit the floor with a heavy metallic thud. He looked at Rosa, expecting to see the breaking point, the moment her spirit finally fractured like the ceramic at her feet. Instead, he saw a woman who was already picking up the pieces in her mind before he had even finished breaking them. Disgusted by a strength he couldn't understand, Luca turned his broad back to her. He pushed through the door without a backward glance, his posture upright and confident, the image of a man who believed he had just deleted a problem from his map. He left behind a sea of shattered porcelain and the smell of wasted coffee, convinced that by tomorrow, the unmovable Rosa Marconi would finally be gone. He didn't see her kneel. He didn't see her reach for a single broken shard of a mug with trembling but determined hands. He simply walked toward his waiting car, a king who had mistaken destruction for victory. The clinical scent of the hospital always felt like an affront to Luca, a sterile world he couldn't intimidate or control. He moved down the hallway of the private wing, his dark trousers whispering against the polished floors, finally pausing at the door to suite 402. Inside, the machines hummed a steady, mechanical rhythm, but the woman in the bed provided the only light he truly cared about. Isabella Moretti looked frail, her skin still possessing the translucent quality of someone who had recently stood at death's door, but her eyes sparked with a life that hadn't been there 3 months ago. "You look like you've been carrying the world on those shoulders again, Luca," Isabella said, her voice thin but warm. She reached out, her hand trembling slightly as she touched the edge of the tattoos blooming across his arm. Luca sat by her side, the violence of the morning still humming in his veins like a low-frequency fever. He had spent his life ensuring she wanted for nothing, but no amount of money or influence had been able to fix her failing kidneys. He had watched her wither until a miracle arrived in the form of an anonymous donor, a person who had asked for nothing in return for the gift of life. "The project is moving forward, Ma," Luca replied, his voice softening into a register only she ever heard. "It's going to be the biggest thing this city has ever seen, a fortress." Isabella smiled, but it was a sad, knowing look. "Buildings are just stone, Luca. It's the people who stay that matter. I keep thinking about her, you know, my angel." Luca tightened his grip on her hand. He had tried to find out who the donor was, offering bribes to hospital administrators that would have bought a fleet of ambulances, but the privacy walls had remained high. "She saved me for no reason at all," Isabella whispered, looking toward the window where the afternoon sun caught the IV line. The doctors said she stayed until I was out of surgery, then disappeared back into her life. She didn't want a reward. She didn't want to be a hero. She just saw someone in need and gave a piece of herself away. Isabella turned back to him, her gaze piercing. Promise me you'll be a builder of more than just towers, Luca. There is a debt of kindness on this family now. We owe the world for my life. Luca nodded, the silent promise hanging in the air. He pictured the fortress rising, the glass reflecting the clouds, but for a fleeting second, the image was replaced by a vision of a woman kneeling on a coffee-stained floor, picking up shards of a life he had just tried to erase. He pushed the thought away, telling himself it was just the stress of the deadline, unaware that the angel his mother prayed for was currently sweeping up the wreckage he had made. After leaving his mother's bedside, Luca stepped into the small office reserved for family consultations. A thick stack of post-operative documentation sat on the desk, waiting for his signature to authorize the final transition to home care nursing. He flipped through the pages with the practiced efficiency of a man used to processing high-stakes contracts, his mind already drifting back to the blueprints of his headquarters. He signed off on the medication schedules and the physical therapy intervals, but as he reached the final section, the donor verification and compatibility log, a single sheet of paper slid out from the folder. It was a standard administrative form, the kind designed to be filed away and forgotten, but it held a small, stapled photograph of the donor for medical identification purposes. Luca's breath hitched. Looking back at him from the grainy, clinical photo was a woman with curly dark hair pulled loosely back and a face defined by quiet, unshakable strength. It was the same woman who, only hours ago, had stood behind a ruined counter in a stained apron. The name printed in bold, black ink beneath the image was Rosa Marconi. The office seemed to shrink around him. He stared at the date of the surgery 6 months ago. While he had been sitting in his air-conditioned office plotting the acquisition of her corner, Rosa had been lying on a surgical table, giving up a part of herself to save a woman she didn't even know. She had endured the pain, the recovery, and the risk, all while Luca's lawyers were hounding her with threats and empty promises. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. The angel his mother whispered about, the woman he had promised to honor with a debt of kindness, was the same obstacle he had just tried to crush under his boot. He remembered the sound of the ceramic shattering on her floor and the way she had watched him with that unnerving, silent heartbreak. She hadn't fought back because she knew something he didn't. She had already given him everything, and he had responded by trying to take the last thing she had left. Luca looked down at his own hands, the tattooed knuckles that had swept her livelihood onto the floor. For the first time in his life, the weight of his own power felt like a leaden shroud. He wasn't a king, he was a debtor. He closed the file slowly, the paper crinkling under the pressure of his grip, and walked out of the hospital into the cooling evening air, the shadow of his rising fortress finally looking like the cage it truly was. The city lights usually felt like jewels in Luca's crown, but tonight they were cold, mocking pinpricks against the darkness. He walked without a destination, his heavy boots echoing through the alleyways that bordered the skeleton of his new empire. For years, he had operated under a simple code. Power was the only currency that mattered. But as he paced the perimeter of the half-built fortress, the weight of the medical file in his mind felt heavier than the concrete and steel rising above him. He found himself standing across the street from the darkened storefront of Mama Rosa's Café. In the dim glow of a street lamp, the closed sign hung crookedly behind the glass. He could see the faint silhouette of a woman sitting on the floor, her back against the counter, surrounded by the shadows of the wreckage he had created. The realization was a slow, agonizing poison. Every time he had sent his men to intimidate her, every time he had authorized a new legal threat, she had been recovering from the surgery that saved his mother's life. While he was obsessing over the square footage of a lobby, she had been quietly enduring the physical and emotional toll of a sacrifice she never intended for him to know about. He had treated her like a piece of refuse to be cleared away, never imagining that the heart he was trying to break was the very reason his mother's heart was still beating. The ghost of his own cruelty haunted the pavement. He remembered the sound of the vintage espresso machine hitting the floor, the machine Rosa's mother had brought over from the old country, the center of a heritage he had dismissed as insignificant. He had walked away with a confident stride, feeling like a victor, while the woman who had literally given a piece of herself for his family knelt in the dirt he had made. Luca looked up at the fortress sign looming over the block. It was supposed to be his masterpiece, a testament to his untouchable status. Instead, it looked like a monument to his own blindness. He wasn't the king of this city. He was a man who had nearly destroyed his own savior. The silence from the cafe was louder than the construction engines, a quiet, devastating accusation that stripped away his armor. For the first time in 35 years, Luca Moretti didn't know how to move forward. He only knew that the man who had walked into that cafe this morning had to die so that a different man could return to it. The bell above the door rang with a hollow, lonely sound as Luca Moretti stepped back into the wreckage. The air still held the ghost of spilled espresso and damp sugar, but the violence of the previous day had been replaced by a heavy, stagnant grief. Rosa was there, kneeling in the same dark apron, her hands red-raw from scouring the floor. She didn't look up when the heavy door clicked shut. She didn't need to. She knew the weight of his stride. Luca stopped several feet away, his broad shoulders casting a long shadow over the broken tiles. For the first time, his upright posture felt like a burden rather than a badge of power. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a check, the numbers written upon it enough to rebuild the cafe 10 times over and buy a villa on the coast besides. "I saw the file, Rosa," he said, his voice gravelly and stripped of its usual iron. "I know what you did for my mother. I know about the transplant." Rosa finally looked up. Her eyes weren't filled with the gratitude he expected, nor the fear he was used to. They were tired. She looked at the check in his hand as if it were a piece of trash he'd just dropped on her clean floor. "Is that what this is?" she asked softly, her voice echoing in the hollowed-out shop. "A transaction? You think you can put a price on a life or a price on the memory of my mother's kitchen?" "It's an apology," Luca countered, stepping forward. "It's a way to make it right. Take the money. Rebuild. I'll send my best crews. We can make this place the jewel of the block." Rosa stood up slowly, wiping her hands on her stained apron. She didn't take the check. Instead, she walked to the door and held it open, her gaze fixed on the rising steel of his fortress outside. "I didn't give that kidney to a mafia boss," she said, her voice steady and cold. "I gave it to a dying woman who needed a miracle. I don't want your blood money, Luca, and I don't want your help. If you truly want to make it right, then give me the only thing you've spent months trying to steal." She looked him directly in the eyes, her quiet resilience cutting through his armor more effectively than any blade. "Leave me in peace. Take your towers and your checks and your noise and forget this corner exists. That is the only payment I will accept." Luca stood frozen, the check feeling heavy and useless in his hand. He was a man who had bought his way out of every problem, yet he was standing before the one person he owed everything to, and his wealth was worth nothing. He tucked the paper away, lowered his head, and walked out into the bright, unforgiving sun, leaving the angel alone in her ruins. The following morning, the usual roar of heavy machinery at the fortress site fell silent. For the first time in years, the jackhammers and cranes stood still, but the street in front of Mama Rosa's cafe was far from empty. Luca Moretti didn't arrive in a sleek black car with an envelope in his hand. He arrived in a pair of rugged work boots, a tool belt cinched around his waist, and 3 of his most skilled carpentry crews trailing behind him. He didn't ask for permission this time. He simply began to work. Rosa watched from the sidewalk, her arms crossed, her eyes narrowed in suspicion as the men who had spent months intimidating her began to unload crates of premium mahogany and hand-pressed Italian tile. Luca himself was at the center of it, his broad, tattooed shoulders glistening with sweat as he personally hauled the heavy, broken espresso machine out to the curb. He didn't look at her, and he didn't offer any more hollow apologies. He just worked. The process was rhythmic and intense. The shattered linoleum was stripped away to reveal the original hardwood, which Luca spent hours sanding by hand until the grain shone like gold. His crews replaced the broken glass with reinforced, floor-to-ceiling windows that caught the morning light in ways the old shop never had. They didn't just patch the holes. They elevated the space, integrating the cafe's classic warmth with the sleek, modern durability of the high-rise rising next door. By mid-afternoon, Luca was on a ladder, his large hands surprisingly delicate as he reinstalled the Mama Rosa sign, buffing the brass handles until they gleamed. He spent the evening installing a custom-built counter, carved from a single piece of dark walnut, designed to endure for another 100 years. Throughout the day, the neighborhood watched in stunned silence. The untouchable king was covered in sawdust and grease, laboring over a corner he had once deemed insignificant. He wasn't building a skyscraper. He was painstakingly restoring a legacy. As the sun began to dip behind his steel towers, Luca finally stepped back, his chest heaving, his dark trousers covered in white plaster dust. The cafe was no longer a ruin. It was a sanctuary of polished wood and bright glass, standing defiant and beautiful in the shadow of the giants. He wiped his brow and looked at Rosa, not with the arrogance of a boss, but with the quiet exhaustion of a man who had finally understood that real power is found in the things you choose not to break. The following week, the scent of fresh espresso and Italian pastries once again drifted from the corner of 5th and Main, but the atmosphere inside the cafe had shifted. It was no longer a place of quiet siege, but a sanctuary of reconciliation. Luca stood near the new walnut counter, his presence less like a looming shadow and more like a silent sentinel, as a sleek car pulled up to the curb. Isabella Morty stepped out, leaning lightly on a cane, her eyes bright with a determination that transcended her physical frailty. Rosa met her at the door. There were no cameras, no lawyers, and no crowd, just two women who shared a bond of blood and sacrifice that most would never understand. Isabella took Rosa's hands in hers, her grip surprisingly firm. "I've spent months praying to meet the woman who gave me a second chance," Isabella whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I didn't realize I had been looking for you my entire life." They sat at a small round table in the sunniest corner of the cafe, the very spot Luca had once tried to erase. As the steam rose from their cups, Isabella reached into her purse and pulled out a weathered, sepia-toned photograph, its edges frayed by time. It showed two young women standing in a dusty olive grove in the old country, their arms linked, smiling against a backdrop of sun-drenched hills. "My mother always spoke of a woman who saved her during the Great Famine," Isabella said, sliding the photo across the table. "She was a daughter of the Marconi family. When the crops failed and the village was starving, your grandmother secretly funneled flour and oil to my mother's house. She risked everything to keep a rival family from perishing." Rosa traced the faded image with a trembling finger, recognizing the defiant set of the jaw in the younger woman, the same resilience she saw in the mirror every morning. "She told me stories of a girl she called Sorella di Cuor, her sister of the heart," Rosa murmured, her eyes welling with tears. "She said they were separated by the war, and she never knew if her friend had survived." "She survived because of your family," Isabella said, looking up at Luca, then back to Rosa. "And now I am here because of you. It seems the Marconis have been keeping the Mortys alive for generations." The revelation hung in the air, a bridge of history spanning the gap between the ruthless present and the compassionate past. Luca watched from the counter, realizing that his fortress was merely a pile of stones compared to the enduring strength of this generational debt. The cafe wasn't just a piece of property. It was a sacred ground where a circle of kindness, started decades ago in a distant land, had finally closed. In that moment, the rivalry died, and a new legacy began, one built not on power, but on the profound, quiet truth that no act of mercy is ever truly lost. The morning sun glinted off the glass of the new fortress headquarters, but for the first time, the massive steel tower didn't seem to be the most important structure on the block. At its feet, nestled into the very heart of the development, Mama Rosa's cafe was alive with the sound of grinding beans and quiet laughter. Luca Moretti stood on the sidewalk, his broad shoulders relaxed as he watched a diverse stream of neighbors, construction workers, office executives, and long-time residents, pass through the weathered wooden door he had personally polished. He looked up at the skyscraper that bore his family name, realizing that while he had spent a decade obsessed with the permanence of concrete, he had been building on a foundation of sand. Concrete could be cracked, and steel could be melted, but the Sorella di Cuor bond between Rosa and his mother was a structure that had survived famines, wars, and his own blind rage. He understood now that he hadn't won by acquiring the land. He had nearly lost everything by failing to see the value in the people who occupied it. True strength, Luca realized, was not found in the power to destroy a small shop, but in the humility required to preserve it. He had walked into that cafe weeks ago believing that everything had a price, only to discover that the most precious things, loyalty, sacrifice, and the breath in his mother's lungs, could never be bought. They were gifts, part of a generational harvest of mercy that had been sown long before he was born. As Rosa stepped onto the sidewalk to set out a chalkboard sign, she caught Luca's eye. There was no bow of submission, and there were no more envelopes of protection money between them. There was only mutual respect, a silent acknowledgement that they were both part of a story much larger than real estate or power. Luca reached out, not to push a counter or sweep a mug, but to steady the sign for her. This was the final lesson of the shadow boss. The strongest walls aren't built to keep people out. They are built to protect the kindness that keeps us all alive. Violence and intimidation are temporary tools that eventually rust, but an act of selfless kindness creates a circle that always finds its way back home. As the city hummed around them, Luca Moretti finally turned his back on the wreckage of his old life, walking forward as a man who understood that a single wooden door could hold more weight than 1,000 tons of steel. If you ever find yourself in a position of power, remember, the person you choose to crush today might be the seed of your survival tomorrow. Kindness has a longer memory than we think.